Good morning to everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I've been suffering from a cold this week, so the voice is a bit scratchy and gravelly, so apologies for that. As we continue in our studies in the book of Ecclesiastes, coming today to Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and the very well-known section, and we'll go into chapter 4 and 5 as well, but just some verses from chapter 3 to start with. A time for everything. There is a time for everything, a season for every activity under the heavens. A time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant, a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to search and a time to give in, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. So we're looking at this series in Ecclesiastes under the heading Life Under the Sun. Today it's about the brokenness of life. We saw 2 weeks ago that Solomon uses the word meaningless 38 times, life under the sun 25 times. By that he means life lived without reference to God, life lived without any thought of a final day of accountability. In other words, a life that lived in this way often leads to emptiness. It's very fleeting and it's very transient. And that's what we looked at last time. And as we look at our wider world, we see that so many people, sadly, this is how they view life and this is how they live life. Now in chapters 3, 4, and 5, the teacher, who is Solomon, the author, he points to the meaningless of life in the sense of the sinfulness or the brokenness or the unfairness of life. That's the context of chapters 3, 4, and 5. He's really expanding on this idea of the brokenness of life. He explains more about the consequences of our rebellion against God. Now we know that that has been in the world ever since our original ancestors rebelled against God in Genesis chapter 3, that every single human being that has been born ever since has been born not inherently good, but inherently broken. And that we need to find our way back to God, and we do that through a relationship with Jesus Christ. But ever since then, life under the sun has been us human beings trying to live without God. So where are the places that Solomon mentions in particular where this goes wrong? There are probably many other places as well. Well, in chapter 3 and verse 16, he says, I saw something else under the sun. In the place of judgment, wickedness was there. In the place of justice, wickedness was there. He looks at the government, he looks at the law courts, he looks at law and order, those responsible for law and order, those responsible for justice. And what does he see? Fairness or justice? No. He sees wickedness and evil, and he says there's nothing new under the sun, which we well know. Instead of justice and righteousness in high places, you find bribery, you find corruption, you find misappropriation of funds, a little bit like the old South Africa, a little bit like the new South Africa. There's nothing new under the sun, because that's the nature of sin and brokenness. And James Lowe, a lawyer in England, once said, truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. We read in chapter 4 and verse 1, again I looked and saw all the oppression that was taking place under the sun. I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they have no comforter. Power was on the side of their oppressors, and they have no comforter. Those in high places who have political and economic power, they oppress the poor, the voiceless, the powerless, and those who are powerless have no one to turn to. I don't know if you've noticed on the YouTube programs, a man who arose to fame from nowhere. His name is Oliver Anthony. He put a voice up on YouTube, which has got 47 million hits since the 8th of August. We're talking now in less than a month. And it's a song which is called Richmond, North of Richmond. And it's a song that has been written, it's a protest song. It's sung with great passion. It's not I don't think the man's got a particularly good voice. That's my humble opinion. But it's a protest song. And he is protesting on behalf of the working classes in America, the 40 or 50 million working men and women in America who are being squeezed out. Life is becoming more and more difficult for them. And as I say, it has struck a note. It has struck a chord. Even the politicians are taking note of it, however they view it. Because it's a song on behalf of the voiceless, the powerless. And that is what Solomon is referring to here. People who have power stepping on the little people, as long as they don't get caught, as long as they can get ahead. Don't you sometimes long for justice to be done? When you turn on the television, when you read the newspapers, when you read the news on your cell phone, and you read all the time, endlessly it seems, about corruption and exploitation, and you just long for justice and fairness, for the bad guys to be brought to justice. And as we all know, a lot of the time that just doesn't happen. There just isn't justice. I don't need to tell you that we live in a world where often murderers and criminals and political criminal syndicates get let off the hook by some kind of legal technicality. And politicians use taxpayers' hard-earned money to avoid their day in court, seemingly endlessly. We read of company directors making off with millions. We read of their ill-conceived practices causing people to lose half of their investments. And that is hardly that's just touching the tip of the iceberg. And so we see that there's chaos and decay all around us. Chapter 5 and verse 8, he puts it like this. If you see the poor oppressed in a district and justice and rights denied, do not be surprised at such things. For one official is eyed by a higher one, and over them both are others higher still. Well, that sounds just like modern day bureaucracy and government. You know, brother looks after brother, comrade looks after comrade. No one is responsible, no one is accountable, and the greatest tragedy is truth and righteousness. Do you remember Robin Hood from your mother's reading at bedtime? Robin Hood was from the country of Nottingham. He stole from the rich and gave to the poor, and it was justified by saying the end justified the means, kind of jungle justice. One writer analyzing Robin Hood put it like this. What we would not have tolerated was to discover later on that Robin Hood was really a con man with a bank account in Switzerland. We would not have handled him ripping off the peasants and then living in a mansion he built from the money he siphoned off the rich, all the while playing the role of Mr. Nice Guy. Sad endings we can handle, but not unjust ones. Suffering makes us sad, but injustice makes us mad. In our childlike minds, we still long for fairness and equity. We still want stories to end well so that people can live happily ever after. So there is injustice in high places, in governments, and in politics. But the brokenness is also seen in the working world. There is the world of business and education and media, medicine, law, and yes, even the church. So much of it, he tells us, is about rivalry and envy and jealousy. And he says in chapter 4 and verse 4, and I saw that all toil and all achievement spring from one person's envy of another. This too is meaningless, chasing after the wind. There's a bit of a progression here in chapter 4 and verse 1. He speaks about oppression and cruelty. And then chapter 4 verse 4, as I've mentioned, there's rivalry, there's envy. Then you get to chapter 4 and verse 8, there was a man all alone. He had neither son or brother. There was no end to his toil, and yet his eyes were not content with his wealth. For whom am I toiling, he asked, and why am I depriving myself of enjoyment? This too is meaningless, a miserable business. It's true that today people climb higher and higher, and in the end they reach the top, but they haven't got any friends. It's a very penetrating analysis of our materialistic culture, living life under the sun, living as though all that matters is money and how much money we have in the bank account, which is how he puts it in chapter 5 and verse 10. Whoever loves money never has enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with their income. This too is meaningless. At a time when he was the wealthiest man in the world, Nelson Rockefeller was asked, "When will you have enough?" And he said, "When I make 1 more million." And that's how Solomon puts it in chapter 5, verse 11, "As goods increase, so do those who consume them. And what benefit are they to the owners, except to feast their eyes on them?" By contrast, he says in verse 12, the sleep of a laborer is sweet, whether they eat little or much. But as for the rich, their abundance permits them no sleep. And we think of that in our own lives, in our younger days, maybe in our 20s, when we lived relatively simply. But now, where there's property, it needs to be looked after. When there are investments, they need to be watched over. Where there are cars, they need to be cared for. And with it all comes more responsibility, more insurance, and less sleep. Now, the teacher here needs to be said, he's not against wealth or money. He's not against achievement or ambition in and of itself. He's not saying it's wrong to have wealth or to be the CEO of a company. But what he is saying, if that is the sole purpose of one's life, well, then it is meaningless. It cannot be the sole purpose and the sole reason why we get up in the morning. And so he ends up where he ended up last week, and with this we end as well. He reminds us that ultimately we are going to die. He says in chapter 3 and verse 18, "I also said to myself, as for humans, God tests them so that they may see that they are like the animals. Surely the fate of human beings is like that of the animals. The same fate awaits them both. As one dies, so dies the other. All have the same breath. Humans have no advantage over animals. Everything is meaningless." He's reminding us that like the animals, we come from dust and we return to dust. And that is the bitter irony of it all, that if there is no God, if there is no judgment, if there is no final reckoning and accountability, there's no point in being moral in this life or living a wise or righteous life. As we saw last time, there's no remembrance of us. So what is the answer as we close to the brokenness and the distortions of this world? Well, once again, we go to that final chapter, to chapter 12 and verse 13. Here's the conclusion of the matter. "Fear God, keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind." The judgment, final judgment of God, is one of the great doctrines in the Bible. Yes, there may be no justice in this life, in this world, but there will be justice in the next world. And God will bring every deed into judgment, including all the hidden things. And the books will be opened, the wrongs will be righted. And those many, many things for which there has been no fairness or justice in this world, well, one day there will be a day of reckoning and a day of accountability. And therefore, he says, secondly, it makes sense to fear God, which means that we trust God. We live under the authority of God. We live as though we know and are aware that finally, ultimately, we are accountable to God and we need to get right with God. And how do we get right with God? Well, we get right with God as we come to an end of ourselves and we cry out to him and we say, "Oh God, will you rescue me from myself and from my wrongdoing? And will you also rescue me from the brokenness of this world and from my own brokenness? And will you make me a Christian and help me to live under your rule and under your control?" Because that's what it means to be a Christian. And so let's close in prayer, and thank you again for joining me today. Lord, I don't understand it all, but I know that I need you, and I know that I've sinned. And I know that Christ died on the cross for sinners like me. And so I pray today, Lord, if I've never prayed this prayer before, will you save me? Will you make me a Christian? And will you give me new meaning and purpose and hope in life? And we ask this for Christ's sake. Amen.